Okay. Hello, everyone. Melissa, can you hear me? Since you're
I can.
Great. Hello, and welcome to the Gen North America webinar series. This is the final webinar of 2017, and we thank you for joining us. Before turning this over to our host, Tom Getches, immediate past chair of North America, I'd like to address some meeting rules. Please note that all participants were muted upon entry to the meeting to ensure a smooth recording of this session. Please do not unmute yourself, and please do not place us on hold. If necessary, please leave the meeting and redial back into the meeting when you're available. We have allotted 30 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. Throughout the presentation, please submit your questions directly to the participant named 001 Thomas Getches, who also happens to be our host. Use the chat feature to communicate with Tom. We will convey all your questions to the presenter at the end of the session. And our presenter today is our esteemed leader, Dr. Melissa Brouwers. So I'm turning it over to our host, Tom, now. Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you very much, Hirado. Yes, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be listening in the world. I'm pleased you took some time out of your day to join us for this very informative and educational webinar by Dr. Melissa Brouwers. Melissa is a professor at McMaster's University in Hamilton, Canada, and the director of the Program in Evidence-Based Care Clinical Practice Guidelines Program of the Ontario Cancer System, Cancer Care Ontario. She is a health services researcher with special interest in science and the practice of guidelines and the design of evaluation of rigorous but practical solutions to bring evidence into the decision-making process for patients, clinicians, and policymakers. So I hope you'll do what you can to minimize your distractions wherever you're watching and engage with us as best as you can. If you haven't already, click on the link in the chat box and access the first poll, which helps us get a good sense of who is participating and what your role is with respect to guidelines. At Melissa's prompting, I'll post 3 more polls. They'll open in a new browser window. Complete them promptly so I can summarize the responses for Melissa. If you have any questions, as Hirado said, utilize the same chat feature and direct your questions to me. Melissa knows I may interrupt her gently to ask clarifying questions, so don't feel like you need to save your questions until the end. I'll make a judgment call as to when I might pose those to her. So now that's out of the way, Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to you. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Tom. And just to let everyone know, when we were practicing on our new platform, we did find there was a few glitches trying to get in if you were outside the U.S. It seems smoother today, but here are ways if you're calling from Canada Mexico or elsewhere outside the U.S. in case you're having a trouble getting the audio. Here's pictures of what I look like and what Tom looks like. This webinar is going to be recorded and it will be made available to individuals who weren't able to attend today. So if any of your colleagues or friends weren't able to make it, please let them know that that will be made available, and it will be made available in the library webinar section of the GIN network. So today I'm going to talk about the AGREE ecosystem. And the goals of today, I'll show you in just a sec. I first want to, oh, there we are again, looking fantastic. Some of the important stuff first. So first of all, with respect to competing interests, I have no financial conflicts of interest, and my intellectual and academic ones are that what I'll be talking about today, the AGREE suite of tools, are things which have been a lot of my research activity for the last several years, so that's an important consideration. The funding for the work I'm going to be discussing has come primarily from the Canadian Institute of Health Research, CIHR, in Canada. The other important stuff, regrettably, this looked actually quite dramatic and fantastic, but I just learned coming on that the animation doesn't work. Underneath all of these sticks of flags are about 40 different people who've been involved in the AGREE research activities as co-investors, co-principal investigators, and collaborators. You can sort of see a peek from the flag that it was very international in scope. And this does not even speak to the several hundred individuals who have been involved as participants. And a special shout out and thank you to those of you who have been participants in the various studies that we've conducted over the last 17 years or so. But maybe in the recording, maybe the animation will work because it was quite lovely. So today, what I hope to do is to give you a wee history lesson of where the AGREE started from and really the philosophy that underpins the AGREE research activities. But I'm going to focus primarily from our work from AGREE 2 onward. And what I'm hoping to achieve by the end of the session is that you have a sense of the philosophy and approach that we undertook to develop the AGREE tools, resources, etc., that you understand what the different AGREE tools and resources are, for what purpose or what question they can best answer, and also to give some guidance about how to use the different tools in combination to help you achieve specific goals. There are often frequently asked questions that come to us via email or through conferences or through our question box on the AGREE website. And what I'm hoping to do is also address some of these frequently asked questions and then any other questions that you have. So that's the goal for today. I would be remiss if we did not have some good quizzes. So for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Tom to introduce the first quiz. And this quiz will help me get a sense of who is at the table and the background you have with the AGREE tool. So Tom?
Yeah, so I've posted the second link and asked that people go down to the chat and click on that and start submitting their responses. It's pretty cool on my side when I see you know, people accessing these links and the data all coming in real time. I'll tell you, Melissa, for the previous poll, for those that answered the questions about who's in the room, a majority, as we have suspected, are guideline developers. About 60, almost 70% are guideline developers.
That's great.
40% are methodologists.
Okay, excellent.
And then a little smattering here and there. So let me open up my results on the poll here and see. We've already got a good handful of responses. So for people that have heard about, one of your questions was, have they heard about AGREE as it relates to the tools? Almost 90% said yes, and that's a good thing. So you're among friends here, I believe. tools that they are aware of and used, overwhelming majority is the agreed to instrument, almost 94%, and the original agree gets about 60%. The GRS and the HS are about maybe 10 to 15%, and
All
then
right.
the REC and the reporting checklist are at about 30%.
Okay.
And then the common purpose, that last question you had for those agree tools, most people said all of the above. So serving as methodological blueprints, informed content, or evaluate the quality of guidelines.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom, and thanks for those of you who provided some feedback. That's really helpful. Okay, so why don't we get started? And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that we are in the holiday season, so perhaps you will consider all the agree tools that I'm about to speak about as lovely little gifts for the guideline community. So maybe that will be a result of today. So let's talk about the philosophy of the agree as the starting point. And even before I can get into the philosophy, it does highlight some really frequent questions that we are asked. Questions such as, why does it take so long to make your agree tool? Why are all those steps happening, and are they truly necessary, etc.? So that's a good segue into thinking about what we were trying to achieve and what we have hopefully been achieving with the agree. So I want to first think about it in the context of clinical actions, the types of clinical actions and clinical recommendations that we put forward as guideline developers or guideline methodologists. And our expectation when we're doing clinical practice guidelines and trying to recommend one clinical action over another is that these choices are based in part on the best evidence that's available. And I think most people would agree. Yes, I'm going to assume it's going to be a yes. And this is important. And why do we think about this? Is because what we want to be able to do is optimize the benefits for patients, help mitigate and minimize the harms or adverse effects for patients, to ensure that the clinical actions that we're recommending are acceptable, they're implementable, they're usable, and that there's, in many contexts and settings, that there's a return on the investment. In other words, that you get a gain for the financial and human resource investments that are made. So I think most people in the clinical practice guideline enterprise would agree with these statements. So our argument, as we think about tools and resources to support the clinical practice guideline enterprise, is that we believe we should expect methodological recommendations to also be based on evidence. And why? Because we want to be able to optimize benefits, minimize harms, ensure what we're doing is acceptable, implementable, and usable, and there's a return on investment. Now, some people would argue, what are we talking about? We're just talking about a method or a tool. What's the harm in creating one of those? Well, it's not the same as a clinical harm, but I think one of the things that we all need to think about is that every methodological step, every methodological requirement or standard or expectation that is put out requires time, requires skill development, requires money, and it prolongs the process. And so potential harm is that we're creating guidelines that take forever to create, for example, and that would delay getting good clinical action out in settings that would be of benefit to patients. So this idea of making sure that the resources and tools and methods we create in the guideline enterprise really do contribute benefit, really do minimize harm, and are also acceptable, implementable, usable, etc. These cost money to implement, not in terms of getting access to them, but in terms of the effort to put in them. So we want to be judicious in what we're recommending. So philosophically, that has been a really key part of how we've been thinking about the development of the agreed tool. So what we want to do is use the best methods that are available to establish that the agreed tools are psychometrically sound, that is, that they're reliable and valid, that they're acceptable, implementable, and usable, and that the effort to use the tools does provide a return on the investment, whether it's time, effort, or money to be able to implement them. So that philosophy we really embrace. So it comes down to we demand evidence and we want people to think critically. And when I'm talking about thinking critically, it's not to think critically about the evidence. We expect that, but to think critically about how these methods and resources and tools can be used for your benefit and that they are helpful to you. So that's really an important consideration. And so we've really approached our development of the AGREE suite of tools as pragmatic scientists. We want to ensure that there's good rigor, that we can justify the methods and the processes we use, but we also have to think about how these tools can be used practically in different settings, contexts, or environments. So that really represents the philosophy that we've approached the development of our work. So, a little bit now about history. And history can be captured. There's many, many people who've been involved in the development of the AGREE. But I would argue that some real key people, at least in informing me and influencing me and being inspirations to me, are these three individuals. The woman on the top right is Françoise Clouzot. She was the initiator of getting us to think about a generic tool to support the development and the evaluation of clinical practice guidelines. And this was in the early to mid-1990s. She did that as part of her doctoral work. Françoise has been very involved in the NICE organization and NICE International, and now she's at King Imperial College in the UK. The gentleman to her left is Dr. Jaco Burgers, that I anticipate many of you know. Jaco was also a student in the early 90s, and he did the lion's share of the work also to start developing and testing the original AGREE instrument. And he is in the Netherlands, and he's a past chair of GIN International. The gentleman at the bottom is a mentor. A lot of the original AGREE work and the precursors to the AGREE was done in Europe. It really started in Europe. And the fellow at the bottom right, my mentor, Dr. George Broman, is a Canadian, and he had colleagues in Europe. They invited George along, and 20 years ago, George invited me along. And that's how I got part and parcel of the AGREE enterprise that started in Europe and then migrated through funding from CIHR to Canada. So that's a little bit about the history. And historically, the very first instrument that was around guideline evaluation was the Clouzot instrument. It was coined the Clouzot instrument from Françoise Clouzot, and then the original AGREE instrument, which many of you know. I want you to remember that this was in the 1990s, and at that time, this whole idea of thinking about guidelines and thinking about the quality of guidelines and the implications of quality of guidelines was a really brand new idea. And so these two pieces of work were really seminal in starting off a scientific enterprise, not just in Canada and North America, but internationally around thinking around methods and resources to support these activities. So that's a wee bit of a history lesson. So we developed the AGREE instrument way back when, but we did keep going. And one of the questions we often get is why? Why don't you just stop at the AGREE? And the idea is, when we first developed the AGREE tool, the original one, is that like any new evaluation tool, you start with the first version and then you start reflecting on how you can improve it. One of the things we really wanted to improve is, can we get an understanding of key stakeholders that were more broad than what we targeted with the original AGREE? Because we recognize that clinical practice guidelines, while they were important for clinicians, were becoming more increasingly important for clinical policy and for policy level individuals. And also for practicing clinicians around understanding the methodologies. Practicing clinicians weren't just interested in the final product, the recommendations. They were interested in how to get involved and how to be part of the enterprise. So we wanted to ensure that we were broad in scope of the stakeholders. The first instrument, the original AGREE, it was a good tool, but the measurement properties as one expects with the first version, were modest, and we wanted to improve those measurement properties. And the other thing we wanted to investigate was whether or not there was a role for a shorter scale than the agree. So that led us to develop a large portfolio of research to develop the agree to. The agree to was developed, and its role was to serve as a methodological blueprint to inform guideline development and reporting, and to be a reliable and valid tool to evaluate the quality of clinical practice guidelines. Now, this leads into another frequently asked question. One of the common questions we get is, I thought the agree to was about evaluation. What's this about development and reporting? And there's been a lot of discourse around that. And this is our logic behind how the agree to can be a tool to support development and reporting. If we agree that agree to captures guideline quality features and you're convinced of the methodology we use to get to the items of the agree to tool, then what we would expect is that a guideline, if you want to have a good quality guideline, reports that information about the quality features. Because if you report it and you've done it well, you will be rated, or your guideline will be rated favorably. In order to report the features, that requires the team, the guideline development team, to have addressed them somewhere in the development phase. So whereas people had originally sort of thought of evaluation being separate from reporting, which is separate from development, we saw very much that they were very intertwined. And so that led us to suggest and to be able to brand the agree to tool as one that is a blueprint for development and reporting. That led to another frequently asked question, which is, why do I always use, or why do we always use the term blueprint? It took us a while to find the term, but that term is actually very purposeful. If you look at the agree to, and you look at how it's structured, and it has how to rate the different items and examples and those sorts of things, what the agree to does is to define the quality concepts. It's not an operationalization of those quality concepts. And so we see it as a blueprint or as a signal of the things that people should be thinking about and reporting on as they're creating their guidelines. Operationally, about how you get to those concepts, that requires additional research. And what the agree to has done is where there are really high quality methods, it identifies those as good examples of how you can achieve these quality metrics. So for example, you'll see different tools, resources, etc., that are pointed to as recommended ones to be able to achieve the quality goals. But we also recognize that methods move quickly, new methods come up, and this allows some fluidity and flexibility. So we did not want to use and frame the agree to as an operational tool for guideline development, but rather as a blueprint that helps you identify those things that are important. And tool developers, or part of the operational manual developers, or specific methodologists around the specific concept could create and develop those methods to gold standard methods that the agree to can point to. Also importantly, it really identifies gaps where we don't have really good methods and where we can make investment of time and energy towards other different things. So that's the rationale of why we use the term blueprint. The agree to is, I hope 94% who have heard about it know, it's a 23-item tool comprised of 6 domains and then 2 overall questions. Now, we have to wait for a minute before we go to the next tool, because the question that people often forget is, what else did the agree to project generate? What other stuff? So quiz time number 2, I'm going to send it over to you, Tom, for the next quiz about the $1 million question that we in the Agree to Enterprise have been asking ourselves for a while.
So I've posted that in the chat, and if you can't see the chat, Urato gently reminded me that I think we're seeing the same thing in our windows, but if you look at the top right, you'll see something that says participants, you'll see chat, you'll see notes. If you see the chat that's flashing orange or red, click on that. It should open up the chat window. You can send your questions again into me as they come in, and we are getting some responses. And while we're getting those, Melissa, I wanted to ask you, the Agree 2 evolved into this reporting and standards, and I wonder if you might give a comment about any overlap with the Agree 2 and the Institute of Medicine report for guidelines, if there was any collaboration or harmony between the two, or if there's overlap in the Agree 2 and the IOM standards. I'm curious for your perspective on that.
Yes, so that's a complicated answer. We did chat with the IOM standards folks as they were developing and once they released the IOM standards. And we think that there is quite a bit of harmony between the two of them. It's our understanding that the Agree was part of the types of things that they were looking at in developing the IOM standards. The IOM standards came from a very specific, came as a very specific response to something that was required in the U.S. And so that the Agree was helped inform that process, we find very reassuring. We did ask if the Agree 2 could have just been what the IOM standards would be, and this is where we think about setting and context and all of those sorts of things. And at that time, there was a little bit too much of a stretch, and I think the goal was to really focus on how it could achieve the purpose it was designed and being asked to achieve by Congress.
Okay. No, I appreciate that context. We did have a majority of the participants vote, and it's almost a 50-50 split, but it's about 56% say no. They've not heard of the global rating scale.
Excellent. Well, it's not excellent that people haven't heard about it, but I think that has become a key issue that the research team has tried to address. So, what is this global rating scale? The global rating scale was actually released just shortly after the Agree 2. And this global rating scale is a short form and of the Agree 2. It's comprised of 4 key questions regarding development, presentation, completeness of reporting, quality of guideline recommendations, and then an overall statement. And what we did is we embedded a lot of the content, the specific content that was in the Agree 2, and plunked it in to this global rating scale. And what we found in terms of its measurement properties is that it had really decent measurement properties. But the vast majority of our respondents still preferred the Agree 2. So we've been a little bit quiet around trying to push the global rating scale. But now we're recognizing that perhaps we were too quiet about it, because we do think it has its place, particularly in low resource environments. If you want to do a quick and dirty evaluation, that it does have its place. And so we've now renamed it in the last month the Agree GRS. And when we put together our paper around the Agree ecosystem, we're going to reintroduce this scale. We still think the Agree 2 is the preferred option, but we do think that there is a place for the Agree GRS to serve in certain situations, particularly in evaluation situations. As a tool to inform development and reporting, we don't think it's complete enough. But in a few slides, I'll be showing you how you might choose to use the different tools. But the global rating scale, now called the Agree GRS, is in print and it is available on the Agree website. The other thing, though, we did is not only release the Agree 2 and now the Agree GRS, but we saw, again, based on our philosophy that we see evaluation, reporting, and development quite intertwined, we recognized that we had to make the Agree 2 into more of a checklist shape or checklist format. We were asked by the Equator Network, and for those of you who are not familiar with the Equator Group, it is a group that is responsible for looking through the literature and facilitating the development of reporting standards for different types of study designs. So they create reporting checklists or bring groups together or facilitate the promotion of reporting checklists and standards for different study designs, including clinical practice guidelines. So we made the Agree reporting checklist to achieve a checklist format that the Equator Network requested. And so we also have the Agree reporting checklist. The same content as the Agree to, but more in a checklist shape. The other thing we created at the time was the training platform and My Agree Plus, which is an online platform that you can subscribe to. It has an automatic Agree calculator. You can do work together within your team, all sorts of things. And it also has all of the training platforms, the practice guidelines that you can use, the tutorial, and all of those sorts of things. So those are the results that came out from the Agree 2 project. And then, well, we didn't stop. The Agree 2 looks at the whole guideline process. It thinks about the social components, who's participating, the methods, the scientific elements. So it looks at the entire guideline trajectory. But we know, and there was some good evidence supporting that excellent people, methods, science, they were definitely necessary to create a high-quality guideline, but they were not necessarily sufficient. And that the results of doing these high-quality methods did not necessarily yield recommendations that were always clinically appropriate or implementable or trustworthy. So that led us to another piece of work called the Agree Rec, which is short for Recommendation Excellence. And the focus of the Agree Rec, this tool, was to look at the quality of the recommendations themselves. And just like we did with the Agree 2 and the original Agree, we went through methodological, gold standard methods around generating a tool for evaluation. We did item generation, we tested again, we tested yet again, and we were looking at the reliability, validity, and usability metrics to create this tool. Here are some of the early publications that we created that took place to generate the items. And the Agree Rec is comprised of 9 items, much shorter and more compact than the Agree 2. They're focused on issues of clinical applicability, and it looks at clinical applicability from the perspectives of evidence, the clinical relevance, and the patient or population relevance. It looks at issues associated with the values, and the values of guideline developers, the target users of the recommendations, the patients and populations for who the recommendations are meant, and for policy folks. And then the third domain, or the third category, is implementability, and it really looks at what is the purpose of these recommendations, and does it align with the purpose, and local applicability and adoption issues. So just like in the Agree 2, there are domains and there are items, and they are assessed with 2 core rating scales. One is the quality assessment, and it's looking at the overall quality of each of those items. And just like in the Agree 2, there are specific criteria that are that come from the literature around these quality aspects. The second rating scale is the suitability for use. And this is an optional one. And this question asks, based on the overall quality of this item, the guideline recommendations are appropriate for use in my context or setting. This suitability for use item is used when you are considering a guideline for use for adoption or endorsement purposes to be used and implemented or adopted in your context. So we wanted to have 2 items because the quality might be applicable for many different uses, whether or not the recommendations are of good quality. The suitability is whether or not those recommendations, even regardless of the quality, would be useful in your context. And so that is why we have these 2 rating scales, and there are 2 rating scales that are used for each of the items.
So I want to ask a question on behalf of the audience, Melissa, if that's okay.
Yes.
So someone had posed and said, you know, are those questions sufficient to determine this acceptability for adoption by another group? And what about other areas like currency, consistency, applicability?
Right. So
is that enough? Are you going to talk about that?
I won't talk about that in detail, but we do believe, I'm just going to flip back, a lot of those issues are embedded in these items. It's a bit decontextualized because we're not going to have time to go through every single item in detail. But a lot of those issues are embedded in these things, in these items and domains that I'm presenting now. Some of those are also embedded in the Agree To. And so in a few slides, what I'm going to be showing people is how you can use both of these tools or tactics to use components of these tools together to give you a holistic picture. So the purpose of the Agree Rec is not as a competition to the Agree To or in place of the Agree To. What we are hopeful is that between the 2 tools, that it provides you with the information, as much information as you can use to have that discourse with your group for deciding if a guideline is appropriate for a particular context. Are there more issues that these 2 tools haven't addressed? I bet there are. And because, again, with Agree Rec, it's only going to be version 1 that will be launched, getting this feedback, more real-world feedback, will be helpful. But we went from having many, many different items in the Agree Rec, and we narrowed it and narrowed it and narrowed it and built a lot of these specific components as criteria embedded in each of these items.
Okay,
so hopefully that answers the question a little bit. Other questions around this, Tom, or can I keep going?
No, carry on.
Okay. So, where is the Agree Rec? You know there's 9 items. You know there's 2 rating scales per item. We are hopefully going to release it very shortly after the holidays. We're desperately trying to finish the papers. The manual is now done. So the manual is the thing that will also provide all the instructions, how to use, how to score, all of those specific things. And I can get into more detail about this if you would like around the manual. And we have a checklist version done. So just like we did with the Agree To, we're also making a version look like a checklist so people can use it, again, as a blueprint to help inform the development and reporting issues associated with the recommendations. So that's the Agree Rec. That's a snapshot of the Agree Rec. At the same time as we were developing the Agree Rec, and for something a little bit different, so there was some discussion about if we can do this sort of work for clinical practice guidelines, what about health system guidance? And the 2 gentlemen on this slide, the man to your left is John Levis. He's a professor also at McMaster University. He's part of CHEPA, which is the Center for Health Evaluation and Policy Analysis. And he is a health systems researcher. And he's been very influential with the WHO and other groups around facilitating evidence-informed health system guidance. And so he asked me, what about developing something like the Agree tool, but for Agree Health Systems? The gentleman on your right is Dr. Denis Arco-Areg, and Dennis, if you're an English speaker, was my graduate student, and he took on the early work a lot of the core work to develop this tool. So why would we think about health systems guidance? Well, health system guidance are systematically developed statements that assist with decisions regarding health systems. And there has been quite a bit of work, again, with key folks involved with the WHO around thinking about health system guidance. Health system guidance focuses on providing recommendations about health system governance, financial arrangements, system organization, delivery of services, programs, and the like. And the importance of health system guidance is that while they're similar to, they certainly are not identical to clinical practice guidelines. There's use of different sorts of evidence. There are different types of individuals or phenotypes of participants who need to be brought to the table. There are different circumstances in which health system guidance has to be developed. And so while we think we can borrow from clinical practice guidelines experiences, methods, and resources, we realized, and John was quite convincing, that trying to place clinical practice guidelines methods on health system guidance simply wasn't the same. And so we went about, as we did with other tools, to develop a tool specifically tailored to the types of guidance we're talking about here. The health, and so we went through item generation, testing, retesting, looking at reliability, validity, usability, etc. And the AGREE-HS, the version 1, is comprised of 5 items. It focuses on the topic, methods, participants, recommendations, and implementability. The original version was 33 items. And what we recognized with the 33 items is A, nobody would use it. It's just too cumbersome. And when you're looking at the 33 items, a lot of them integrated or clustered together around these 5 themes. And so the original 33 items became the criteria for these 5 themes. And just as we have in the AGREE, each of these items, 5 items, is answered using a 7-point scale. And just like in the AGREE-2, the AGREE-REX tools, we have definitions, we have where to look, we have examples of these sorts of things. The 5 individual items are accompanied by 2 overall items. Whether or not an individual would recommend this health system guidance in the appropriate context. And then the optional item, if the group or the individuals are considering using it in their context, whether or not they would recommend the use of this tool for their own individual context. So that would be good for endorsement, adaptation, etc. And so that AGREE-REX, or pardon me, that AGREE Health Systems has been an important addition, and it was profiled quite a bit at the Global Evidence Summit in South Africa for some of you who might have been able to attend that conference. Where is the AGREE Health System? Well, just like with the AGREE-REX, we are hoping for early public release in 2018. All the papers have been submitted, the manual is done, and we're still in the process of making a version look like a checklist. So that should be on its way. We are hopeful in January. Finally, elsewhere in the world, what else has been going on? These 3 individuals are the 3 individuals who have been key on developing Checkup. Checkup is a resource. It is a reporting resource around guideline updating and what should be reported in an updated guideline. And these individuals were key leaders in developing it. The AGREE, myself and some of the AGREE members, we assisted, but they were really led by this core team here in Spain. Robin on the left, he did this as part of his doctoral program. Laura and Pablo. And you'll know Laura and Pablo from the Spanish Cochrane Center. Pablo is also a professor, and he's very involved in GIN, and I'm sure many of you know him from GIN International and other methods and research groups. So it was a delight to be able to support and help this group do their work, but it was really led by these 3. So the AGREE ecosystem. If you think about the AGREE, these are all of the bits of the AGREE that have been developed. These 4 highlighted AGREE items are things that really focus on clinical practice guidelines, tools to support clinical practice guideline work. This item, the now highlighted one, focuses on health systems guidance. And then the 3 last ones are more support around existing guidelines, around updating guidelines, around how to do development of reporting blueprints, how to learn, how to have an online platform to do these sorts of things. But this collage represents all the things that the AGREE folks have done. Now, this is all great that we have all of these tools. The question is, how do we work with all of these tools? And the most emphatic advice, if I can give some advice, is to think, be mindful, plan what you want to do, and make decisions by priority. What are your priorities? Be transparent about your priorities and decisions, and be explicit. And I want to go through a few examples about how you might use these tools. So for example, this slide. Let's pretend that you're going to develop clinical practice guidelines from scratch, de novo, and you want to get some direction or advice about how to develop them. I would recommend that you use the AGREE 2 and the AGREE Rec and look at the criteria and the items to see the extent to which they can advise you on the things that you need to capture in your procedures and in the protocols that you do. If you're thinking about how to actually do reporting and you want some direction or advice, the AGREE reporting checklist and the AGREE Recs checklist could be very useful tools because they could be a check and balance for you at the end. They could serve as part of your protocol as you're starting to write your guidelines, but these 2 tools could be extremely useful in the guideline development process. Let's have another situation. Let's say that you have clinical practice guidelines that you're thinking about endorsing or adapting for use in your own context. So you need to do some evaluation. What's some direction and advice about this? Well, first box, you need to think about time, money, and people. And in this example, I'm going to pretend that they're very plentiful. You've got lots of stuff. So the first thing you want to do is choose your threshold. What is good enough? And I'll come to that in a minute because that's the #1 frequently asked question about what's good enough. But if you have lots of money, time, and people, I would suggest that you apply the AGREE 2 in its entirety and apply the AGREE Rec using both the questions around the quality of the recommendations and the suitability of the recommendation in its entirety. Look at the thresholds that you've set up and then narrow down or triage and start considering only those that meet your thresholds. Well, what happens if instead of having plentiful, you have limited? And I have 4 examples that I would recommend you think about. So if time, money, or people are limited, start with choosing your thresholds. And then I would suggest choose the AGREE 2 domain that is the most important one to you. What is the one AGREE 2 domain that you really think you, or with agreement of your stakeholders, that you must achieve high quality? Start with that. Apply that domain, have a threshold, and triage anything that doesn't make that threshold for that particular domain. Then, step 2, apply the remainder of the AGREE 2 to those guidelines that made the first cut, triage those that don't make this cut, and then apply the AGREE Rec tool using those 2 questions that I mentioned. So what you're doing is going through a process of going from many guidelines to fewer guidelines with less work. You're not making the same investment on all of the guidelines. Alternatively, you may say, you know, methodology is important, but if we do not have recommendations that are clinically appropriate, that have recommendations that are of high quality, we don't want to think about them. In that case, then perhaps start with the agree to, or pardon me, the agree rec, and apply the 2 questions. Apply the cutoff that you've already decided a priori. Anything that doesn't make the cutoff, you don't think about again. Then you push it to the next step, and maybe there you do the agreed to domain. On those ones, get rid of the ones that don't make your threshold, triage them, and only apply the agreed to the remainder. Again, you're going from many guidelines to fewer guidelines, but you're not applying the same amount of effort on each of them. Another option is maybe instead of you don't have time to apply all of the agreed to, or maybe you only care about one of the domains on the agreed to, that all you're going to do is apply that domain, triage things that don't make your threshold, and then apply the agree rec to the remainder. A 4th option, when money, time, and people are limited, is maybe you apply the agree GRF, that short 4-item questionnaire that I mentioned earlier. Choose your threshold, get rid of things that don't make the threshold, and then apply your agree to rec. Those are 4 ways that you can make a less burdensome evaluation process and keep with the spirit of what the agree tools are trying to do, which are tools to support your work and to be helpful to you. Let's pretend you're responsible for creating a clinical practice guideline directory. How are you going to evaluate things? Whether or not it's plentiful or limited, there's various options. You can apply the similar types of options we talked about before, but the big difference here is if you look at the bottom right box, the agree rec, you would only apply the first question, which is looking at the quality of the recommendation and the rationale or narrative that was used to underpin it. The idea of looking at suitability for context, we believe that's so context specific that a directory, a general directory, probably it's not worth using that tool. But you could recommend to the users of your directory that they apply that second item, that second degree rec item, around the suitability of the recommendations themselves. So that's a way of being able to use it if you're responsible for developing a clinical guideline directory or registry. Let's pretend you have health system guidance, and it's only focused on health system guidance, direction and advice. The Agree HS can be used as an evaluation tool. The Agree HS checklist will be able to help you in development and reporting. And depending on what your goals are or your expectations are, you may set thresholds, or if it's for development and reporting, then you could just use all of the criteria to inform the process. And finally, what happens if you have a guideline that addresses both health system issues and clinical practice issues? And you'll see several of those by global guideline developers. You'll often see both intertwined. That's where I think you can have options around picking from, based on the examples I gave above, Agree to, Agree Rex, Agree HS, and actually I should put a 4th box in, or Agree GRF. There's probably a role for each of those tools in informing how you would work with, develop, or evaluate a guideline that is looking and bridging across the whole scope of health system and clinical issues. The most important thing is that there's no one best practice to use with limited resources. If you can do the whole package, terrific. If you can't, again, I can't stress it enough that you want to be mindful, think, plan a priority. Think through what are your priorities, what are the most important things. Is it the recommendations are going to be suitable for your environment? Is methodology most important? If it's a balance between the two, then just choose one. But you want to be transparent and explicit in the decisions that you make. Thresholds. I would be remiss if I did not talk about the idea of what makes a good guideline. One of the most frequently asked questions we get, and it's usually been around Agree to, because that is where most people have had experience, But even among our participants in studies, they also asked us, as we were developing the AGREE REX, the AGREE HS, and the AGREE GRS, what AGREE, whatever fill-in-the-blank scores, should be achieved to label a guideline good quality, or to label guideline recommendations good quality? And the answer is, I don't know. And I don't know because I don't have data that if you achieve a score, an AGREE score of X, that it will lead to better implementability of recommendations than an AGREE score of A, or better clinical outcomes or experiences for patients than an AGREE score of B, or fewer negative outcomes or harms or adverse events than an AGREE score of C. And moreover, I'm not even sure if those are the right outcomes. I think another frequently asked questions which relate to this is, will this be a future project of the AGREE? It won't be a future project that I would lead, but there's other people in the AGREE enterprise, and there's lots of people around the world who might be interested in this. But I do suggest a word of caution. I'm not convinced this is an answerable question, and I am a little bit worried that some think it may be answerable, because I'm not sure of the best methods to do so. So, do we use consensus methods? Maybe, but the consensus of who? And can we really create a really good consensus that doesn't create a situation where people that are in well-funded guideline programs are setting parameters that lower resource guideline developers can't achieve? Are we creating methods or expectations that are so high that it's not attainable anymore, and we're so focused on the method that we're not focused on what the purpose of the guidelines are? I'm not sure if we need to identify the specific quality metrics that we can all agree to, rather than what makes sense for your setting. Can you provide a justification, and can you provide a rationale? People might not agree with it, but if you're transparent and it works in your setting and in your context, to me, that's one of the most important things. So I'm going to let you know the types of things that I use when I wear my guideline developer hat with the program and evidence-based care that Tom mentioned. First of all, if there's no systematic review or any evidence of data or that any studies were looked at, we don't even think about that guideline. So that's not even a consideration. But if there are guidelines that do have some sort of studies reported or some sort of systematic review, my preference is to apply the rigor domain of the AGREE to first. I do it because, to me, if it can't achieve a certain level of rigor, I'm probably not interested, because the risk of bias is such that it makes me uncomfortable. What are the values that I've used historically? I've actually used anything less than 50%. We don't look at. Other times I've used less than 75%. And it really, again, depends on the context, the guidelines that are available, the year that we were doing it, and those sorts of things. What we do is we do the rigor domain first. Anything that doesn't make that cutoff, the threshold, 50% on rigor or 75% or whatever it is, we triage those. And then we might apply the rest of the AGREE 2 items to the remainder of the guidelines that made the cutoff. When we bring the AGREE REX into the fold, then we'll probably do one of those C or D or B options that I presented in earlier slides. Simply because in the cancer field, there are so many guidelines that applying everything on anything, it is not a return on my investment. I do not get the benefit of everything to treat everything equally. My guess is we'll probably still start with rigor, apply the AGREE 2, and then apply the AGREE REX. That's my best guess. The other thing, when things are starting to get a little bit equal, to me, I'm more strict around editorial independence. And what I mean by more strict is I think that's a really important consideration. If we don't know how the disclosures were done, funding, those sorts of things, that makes me a bit more nervous than, for example, applicability. Not because applicability isn't important. In fact, I think it's one of the most important considerations in the guideline enterprise. But what I see is great variability across guideline developers, whether or not it's the developer's responsibility to talk about applicability or if it's part of another group's responsibility, for example, in a professional association or those sorts of things. I find it can be quite dispersed. Sometimes it's concentrated. So I tend to be a little bit more lenient on the applicability as a way of cutting out the guideline from consideration. Also, because some of the applicability is so setting dependent, I would rather look at the recommendations that apply to my setting and think about it in that context. So that's what I use. And when people have asked me, these are the suggestions I put forward to folks around thinking about the thresholds to use. I'm not saying that these are correct, but it's something that works in my context. It's acceptable to the stakeholders who are involved in my process and the stakeholders to whom I have to report. So that's how we came up with some of these strategies. And that is what I would suggest users of the Agree 2, the Agree Rec, the Agree HS, any of these tools, think about and use in their context. So just like around how to put the different tools together, about when to use the Agree Rec, when to use the Agree 2, I would also suggest when you're deciding on thresholds, think about it a priori. What are the priorities? Be transparent, be explicit, and that's what you really need to insist on, and that's what you can hold on to. So I'm going to come swing around philosophy again. I think one of the things that are really important in the guideline enterprise is to recognize that guidelines are not a means to themselves. It's really not about the guideline itself. It's a means to the end and how a guideline can contribute to be useful to improve patient outcomes, system outcomes, decision-making, fairness. And so when we look at guideline methods, tools, and resources, how can we create a better message or better recommendations? And you can think about it using different words, whether it's quality, credibility, whether or not they're implementable, unbiased, evidence-informed, acceptable, trustworthy, fair, all of these sorts of things. This is really what we're trying to achieve, are better quality guidelines for the purposes of being able to act. So, the questions when you're thinking about using the tools, the Agree 2, the Agree Rec, the Agree HS, the GRF, the checklist, etc. How can the Agree ecosystem of tools help you create guidelines that will contribute positively to the populations, to the patients and systems for whom you're responsible? You want to demand the evidence, but you really want to think and think critically about how these can be an asset to you and your programs. My final words, I'm going to turn over to Tom. Here are all the ways you can find us. On the agreetrust.org on our website is where the Agree Rec from the Agree HS will be posted, hopefully very early in the new year. And we will send out messages through the Agree North America distribution list when they're posted so people can have access to them. So I'm going to conclude there. Tom, it's your turn for the final question, and then whatever other questions came up during the chat.
Sure. So I've posted the final polling question as you directed on that slide. I'll ask our participants here to still come in and provide us with some of those responses. We did have a couple questions that came in. I want to kick that off while we have responses, and I can summarize those for you. Is there, let me try and merge two of these. So when you talked a couple slides back about your thresholds, or maybe what makes you uncomfortable in terms of some of these judgments, wouldn't the threshold for acceptability be a judgment based on the overall assessment of the agree to and the other tools, as opposed to kind of this automatic red flag and fail of a document not being based on a systematic review? Do you think there's utility in going through the exercise rather than rejecting it outright?
It depends actually on purpose. So I was thinking about endorsement and adaptation. I do think there could be purpose for an exercise for a couple of roles. One, if you're doing a guideline directory, you may go through the exercise. The other thing is you may value the clinical recommendations most. And if there are certain clinical recommendations that the Agree Rex comes out and they're fantastic, maybe the methods, aspects of the methods are less concerning to you. It's an individual difference, and I think what you need to do is to really justify and be transparent about what choices you make. So I think perhaps in some circumstances, if there's no evidence or systematic review to toss them out outright, perhaps in some settings that does make sense. In my setting, when I'm thinking about guideline use and development, it doesn't make sense. If there was no evidence, and I'm not suggesting it has to be high quality evidence, but if there was no attempt at thinking about evidence, then that simply would not work in the context that I have to work in. So I do think it becomes a judgment of the guideline developers or users, and I think it becomes a judgment about the risk and the mitigation of the risk. Are you worried about the potential bias of not having a systematic review or a clear path around where the evidence base has come from? Or are you comfortable enough that, yes, it could be biased, yes, there could be problems, yes, it might not be based on best evidence, but you're okay with that? So again, those thresholds that I've used are the ones that work in my context. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best or right or should be used universally.
Okay. So I'll encourage people to still send in some of their questions. I've got a couple more here, but I wanted to summarize at least the responses we received on the additional training or future sessions. You had a top 3, so the overwhelming majority, about 40%, said that they'd love more training on the Agree Rex. About 20% said the Agree health systems, and then 33%, the last third, oh, someone just voted, so they screwed it up. But no, I'd say about 33% said any or all of the above. Okay. They love training on that respect. So if people wanted more training, do you imagine we might offer that through this GIN North America platform, or would you conduct that?
I think there is a role for maybe doing a future webinar, but very specific on training. Those of you who have gone through the Agree to training where people, when you would do it, you would get feedback, like just in-time feedback around your responses. That's another way that we might look to do that, or some combination. Those of you who might remember years and years ago when we reported on our training of the Agree 2, we did a randomized trial of 3 different methods, and there were no differences. Like everything was enjoyed by people, and I think it's just people self-select into what learning style works best for them. So this is good information about where we should focus first, and then maybe we can bring it to Agree North America as one option, as well as an online training platform as well for folks.
Okay, great. If an organization or someone is trying to build a guideline program, which of these Agree instruments in the enterprise would you recommend they start with to utilize and potentially apply?
I would, in terms of protocol, I would strongly suggest, because you have fluidity with your protocol, or your general protocol, not the guideline-specific protocol, but sort of your procedures manual, I would suggest Agree 2 and Agree Rex. They go hand in hand. And I think looking through The tools can also, especially if you're brand new, signal some really good resources for some of the operationalization of the concepts. So a lot of the concepts that we talk about in Agree 2, we signal to some of the grade working group resources that have been made, or some of the Cochrane resources that have been developed, or other resources from other groups. And so I think reviewing, because they're not huge documents, the two manuals, could be very helpful in crafting how you would like to proceed as a guideline development group. And it will help you make choices.
Okay. Is there a minimum standard or skill set, maybe a knowledge base that's required to apply the Agree instruments?
So the Agree 2, I think it's a little bit more flexible. So one of the things that we recommend is, and this is what we do with any new group, is to practice it first and to get equilibrium, if you will, to see how is it looking, how are folks, are they saying the same thing, are they looking at the same thing? Do you need to operationalize a little bit more specifically for the types of guidelines that you're targeting? So that's one step, is to practice with your little group. With the Agree Rex, my guess is that it will be important, more important than even the Agree 2, to have some clinician input. I think the Agree Rex can be applied by many different groups, and I encourage clinicians to apply it as well. But I would think that the Agree Rex, if you're asking only methodologists to do it, I think it would be challenging. I think you need both clinician perspective and methodology perspective to do that. And again, I would practice first, sort of figure out if everybody's on the same page before moving forward and doing a big evaluation with lots. I also think the Agree 2, if you do the training, that's a really helpful start base as well.
Okay, great. Are there examples of Agree 2 instruments on the Agree Trust website that someone could see as they're trying to go through it themselves?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And what we're hoping to do is make parallel things with the Agree Rex.
Oh, great. I think that'd be very useful. I don't have any more questions that come in, and I've already asked all of my own. Urato, have there been any questions that have, I see you're on mute, but I don't know if there's any questions that came into you, and it was our co-host.
No, none, besides the one I sent and you asked.
Okay. Since we get to talk, any special prerogative that, any burning questions that you want to ask Melissa while you're on here?
I don't think so. I thank people for the time. I thank people who have participated in the studies. They've been a lot of work, but they've taken hundreds and hundreds of people's participation to make the tools. And as you start using the tools, giving feedback about what's working, what's not working, what you like, what you don't like, having that continual feedback is really helpful for us to continue to improve them.
Okay, great. Well, let me wrap this up and say thank you to the attendees that came in today. I love the snowflakes on the screen. We will have a webinar coming up in 2018 on complex interventions. Any of the past webinars that we've recorded that you'd like to see, you can go to the GIN North America webpage and search for webinars there. I think we have almost 3 or 4 years, maybe even more, of archived content that's available to you on the GIN website. So thank you for participating in the webinar today. Melissa Brouwers, Dr. Brouwers, thank you so much for this introduction and the info on the Agree Enterprise. As we stated, this webinar will be recorded and made available shortly after the new year. So with that, we'll sign off. We'll send you and yours your best holiday wishes, and we hope that you will engage with us either on the LinkedIn platform, through Twitter, or by sending an email to the email address that was previously on your screen. So I think with that, let's wrap it up and send our best wishes. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.